Okay.
So for our project, we looked into the Eighth Amendment, specifically cruel and unusual punishment and the death penalty. So what is the Eighth Amendment? The Eighth Amendment states excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted.
Okay, so there are three main parts to this. First is the excessive bail clause. Pretty straightforward, you just can't have bail set too high. And then the excessive fines clause, which we looked into a little bit with Timms v. Indiana, and kind of how it relates on another aspect to civil asset forfeiture in relation to his car. So that's another aspect. And then third is probably the most popular, most well-known, and that's the cruel and unusual punishment clause, which is what we'll be looking into today.
So, the death penalty. Intro to the death penalty. It was established to punish people who commit heinous crimes. It brings up the question of cruel and unusual punishment, if it's cruel and unusual to sentence someone to death. So Mr. Sweeney came in yesterday. He dealt with a bunch of death penalty cases, and he brought up that aggravated murder can lead to capital punishment and the death penalty, which aggravated murder is when you have a plan to go out and kill somebody. And he also said that if you commit murder with another felony, so like if someone's in a car and you kill them and steal their car, that's an armed robbery plus a murder, so that could also be a capital punishment. And just to give you some perspective, there are currently 2,656 people on death row right now, and just this year so far 22 people have been executed that are on death row.
Okay, so Zach was going to present about the arguments for the death penalty, but he's sick today, so we're just going to go over the arguments against the death penalty, but I'll try and go over some of those arguments as I talk about it. So first, I wanted to show this graph. The light green line is the death penalty kind of like approval rating, and then the dark green line is the life imprisonment approval rating. So you can see that in the past few decades, the approval for the death penalty has really gone down. Now in 2019, you can see it's 36%. And as an alternative method for punishment, life imprisonment has kind of started to tick up in popularity.
Without parole, right?
Yeah, without parole. And then this was also another interesting graph that I found, and this is looking into countries that have abolished the death penalty. So these are 11 countries, and all of them have noticed a decline. There's one part that had an uptick, but in the end it was a decline in the murder rates. So this was important because one of the major arguments for the death penalty is the deterrence factor, which says that the death penalty is there so that you aren't like having these harsh crimes like murder, and it's kind of deterring against those, but through this evidence you can see that's not exactly true. And then also 20 states and DC have made the death penalty illegal, and it's important to note that these states haven't noticed like a correlation between the death penalty and their murder rates. So either in both of these examples, you can see that it's not like having the death penalty there is making these crimes like kind of lessening them. And there's also 30 states that still do have the death penalty, including Ohio. And something that we learned yesterday when Mr. Sweeney came was that Cuyahoga County, for the past 2 years, has actually had the most executions of any county in the country.
The most sentences.
Most sentences, yes.
The whole country.
Yeah.
Do you remember what that number was this past year? Five. Right? Yeah. Right, but 5 sentences in the last year, more than any other country, any other county in the country.
Yeah. And then this is kind of another argument against the death penalty, is the risk of innocence, and 71% of Americans believe that this could be a really big factor. So I guess kind of in summary of all of these, there's the risk of innocence, there is kind of the concept that it's not, the deterrence factor isn't actually there, and it's not actually kind of bringing down these murder rates. And then finally, there's really been a decrease in popularity of the death penalty, and most of these are in part due to the cruel and unusual punishments clause of the Eighth Amendment.
So now we're going to talk about specific Supreme Court cases related to the death penalty. So in 1972, Furman v. Georgia. So in this case, Furman broke into a private home in Georgia. He he ended up accidentally killing the owner. He stated that when he wanted to break into the home to rob it, obviously he wasn't expecting to encounter anybody, but the owner heard him, woke up, and he said that as he was trying to flee the scene, he accidentally fell and shot the owner and killed him. So the jury sentenced him to death. He obviously didn't like this, so he believed he was being discriminated against due to his race, because all the jury was white. So he took this to the Supreme Court, where they overruled his death sentence, and this case led to the death penalty becoming unconstitutional for years to come. Until this case, 4 years later, in 1976, Greg v. Georgia. So in this case, Greg committed an armed robbery where he killed someone. So this goes under that, what Mr. Sweeney was saying. He committed a felony armed robbery, and he also killed somebody. So the jury saw that he should be sentenced to death. The Supreme Court upheld this sentence, and this ended up reinstating the death penalty in the United States.
Okay, so this is a fairly recent case, and we talked about it a little bit with Mr. Sweeney yesterday. It's called Buckley v. Precythe, and kind of the main argument here is about lethal injection and the inmate's ability to kind of change this around. So some of the facts of the case are that there was a man named Russell Bucklew who raped, murdered, and killed his girlfriend, kidnapped, and murdered. Yeah.
Yes.
Did I say that? Okay.
That's okay.
And-
This is bad.
Yeah. So he was sentenced to death by lethal injection by a Missouri jury. Unfortunately, due to a medical condition, he had tumors in his throat, and when the chemical was injected into him, it would cause the tumors to rupture and him to hemorrhage, and he would choke to death on his own blood, rather than the much more humane lethal injection that other inmates get. So he argued that in his case it was against his Eighth Amendment right, and that it was a cruel and unusual punishment. So these are two important cases that set precedent for this case. They also talked about alternative chemicals for inmates for lethal injection, and these cases created a two-part test called the Bayes-Glossop test. And the first part of it is that the inmate has to prove that their alternative method, rather than the state-sanctioned lethal injection chemical mixture, they had to prove that it was first feasible and readily implemented, and then second, that it would significantly reduce a substantial risk of severe pain. So this had a really big impact on the Supreme Court's decision, because these were